Very good. So it's almost 7. I only will introduce you and mention the title and what we are talking about, and then I give you the floor. We are
Sounds
here
good.
to listen to you,
Thank you.
not to me. It's very warm in Vienna. I see 11 degrees. Huh?
It's not that warm here.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's, no, it's not yet 7. You know, if we are present in the Kreisky Forum, we wait 5-10 minutes more, but online it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I agree.
Academic quarter of an hour. Yes, now. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, friends. Good evening, Cinzia Bianco. First of all, I'm very happy to have you here, and I'm really very grateful to Cinzia that she joins us from Berlin. You, of course, know our title, Relations Between Europe and the Gulf Monarchies, Past, Present, and Future. Cinzia Bianco is a real expert in Gulf countries, I mean GCC countries, Gulf monarchies. And of course, I mean, working for the European Council on Foreign Relations, she deals very much with European relations. And I think this is a very interesting focus on the GCC states. I honestly admit that I don't know much about it. As I told you, Cinzia is in Berlin at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She's also analyst for Gulf State Analytics and was a research fellow for a project of the European Commission regarding EU-GCC relations. And her academic career, of course, she's Italian, but her academic career took place before the working process, took place in Great Britain with a PhD, with a MA of King's College in London and a PhD in Exeter, already, I mean, focusing on GCC as far as I understand. Well, yes, Gulf countries, GCC, Arab Gulf countries, Arab countries on the Persian Gulf, so we don't get a letter tomorrow if I say, put it like that. Or perhaps we get letters, could also be. GCC countries, monarchies. I mean, if you would look up media archives for articles before 2011, you wouldn't find any. I mean, you would find, but compared with afterwards, nothing. I mean, it was a completely, the last 10 years, we saw a new definition of new roles, amazing developments of policies of the single countries. And of course, these influences are also our policy. I mean, in her introduction, Cinzia wrote that the GCC countries were, the Gulf was considered like an American lake. I mean, it's not for us. And I think this changed, and it really started after 2011, after the Arab Spring. First with a very proactive Qatar. 2012, we thought Qatar is the only active Arab country in a way, when there was no Arab League anymore. And they paid dearly for their support of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and elsewhere, but they also survived quite well. And then we saw, I mean, developing new players in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates, also new rulers, but a new leadership in some of the countries, and two major figures in the Gulf, as you well know. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are crown princes, but we have also new leadership in Kuwait, which was not a generational change, and in Oman, where it was not only a generation change, but really the end of an epoch. So very interesting. And everything happens, and of course is very much related, and we will hear much about that, I think, under the shadow of conflict and tensions with Iran, and which also is directly linked to the war in Yemen. And as you well know, in the last weeks, the war, I mean, it arrived in Saudi Arabia already some years ago with drones and missiles from Yemen, but lately also more in Abu Dhabi. So I give the floor to Cinzia and we will listen to her presentation, and afterwards I take, as always, your questions, your written questions, of course, and try to accommodate all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gudrun, for this invitation. It is a very good opportunity to be talking about this topic, which, as you've introduced masterfully, is becoming even more and more important. The crux of the issue, as you said, is that for the longest time, the Gulf monarchies have been basically very marginal players in international politics. And, you know, we provocatively wrote, it was an American lake. The sense for it is that these are obviously countries whose history is tied to colonialism. They were first founded as political entities under the protectorate of Great Britain. And then when Great Britain decided to leave the Gulf and retreat from east of Suez, as they famously put it, the US sort of grabbed more and more space and increased its role in the region. And it was firstly mostly about geopolitics and the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Arabian Peninsula is obviously very strategically located, but for different reasons across time. At that time, during the Cold War, the reason was the closeness to Iran and Iraq, which in themselves were under the eye of the Soviet Union. And so to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union east, and especially towards the oil-rich countries of the Arabian Peninsula, the United States sort of grew its own role. And it grew its role on a formula that was already active under the British Protectorate, which was that external powers interested in having a standing in the Arabian Peninsula, first and foremost, should provide security, especially against external threats, but also to a certain extent, especially at the time, against domestic threats. So there was a convergence of interests that was very, very clear in the beginning of the US GCC relations. And that was that the US wanted to have a strong security presence to contain the Soviet Union, and the Gulf countries wanted the US to have that presence to contain external and internal challenges that they perceived. So this historical background serves two purposes. The first one is to explain that sort of basic formula that to a certain extent is being put in question only today. And precisely only since the desire of the United States to withdraw and retrench more and more from the wider Middle East and North Africa region, something that really sort of started to take body under the Obama administration, but is now evident under the administration of Joe Biden. And that formula, therefore, when the US withdraws troops and withdraws defense weapons and defense systems from the Arabian Peninsula, or downsizes its military bases there, it sort of betrays, if you allow it the word, that sort of basic understanding that was in place for decades. That leaves the Gulf monarchies searching for more and different security partners, because their security needs and priorities and their threat perceptions have not changed much if we consider the threat perceptions that developed, especially under the Arab Spring, and as you mentioned, mostly on Iran. The second purpose of that brief historical background is also to clarify why Europe wasn't particularly present or active or even particularly interested in the Arabian Peninsula in the past decades. Clearly, European actors individually and had wanted to deploy their security capabilities elsewhere, because their security priorities yesterday, as much as today, lied more towards the east of Europe, for example, or other regions that were much closer and much more neighbors to the European continent itself. Collectively, of course, the European Union struggled and only partially and theoretically, if we will, developed a security actorness and actorship, and therefore was not particularly interested in developing one, especially in the context of the Gulf, because there were different perceptions about, for example, the role of Iran in the region, and of course, if we go back to the Cold War, the role of the Soviet Union. All of that sort of security first approach that defined really the role of external powers in the Arabian Peninsula made Europe less interested in developing that presence that had a clear-cut geopolitical understanding and outlook towards the Arabian Peninsula. And that worked very well for decades, because the United States also wasn't particularly interested in making a lot of room for Europe to play a geopolitical role in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. And, from a European perspective, as we mentioned, the role of the Gulf monarchies in particular was quite limited in its core regions of interest, i.e. the Middle East, the Mediterranean, the Southern Mediterranean, and the Levant. So sort of what happened then before 2011, because of course, Europe did have interests in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, although they were not geopolitical. What they did was focus on what was really, really important for them. Initially, when we look in particular at the relations between the European Union and the Gulf monarchies collectively under the regional organization of the Gulf Cooperation Council, what brought them together when they first negotiated and signed the first treaty, the first agreement in 1989, was energy interests, especially from a European perspective, because then in the late 80s and early 90s, Europe did depend a lot from oil and gas, coming from oil first and then gas, coming from the Gulf monarchies. So they wanted a preferential channel to discuss about energy policies and energy export towards Europe. Obviously, then Europe started to decrease its dependency on oil from Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries, and in general, its dependency on oil, started to diversify energy mix, started to develop relations with other producers of energy that, for example, developed new and discovered new resources in natural gas, liquefied natural gas, and even in renewables, because Europe did start pretty early in slowly adding up more renewable power. So the second issue on which they focused then, given that energy became less important, was trade. And of course, that was also very important for Europe, because the GCC countries are net importer and sort of the weaker end of the trade balance with basically all large manufacturers in the world. They have a rentier economy, which means that their economy basically entirely depends, up to 90% sometimes, on the revenues that they generate by selling oil and gas to the world. And they don't have a diversified economy, so they don't produce much. Their manufacturing industry is mainly petrochemicals and derivatives of oil and gas. So they are net importers of all main other goods, from machinery to textile to food. The big food insecurity in the region, which is, of course, most of it's desert. And then because they are a very wealthy nations and and have a high purchasing power per capita, they also are very much interested in luxury goods, for example. All the infrastructural development, of course, also was a huge part of their spending, and it was almost entirely contracted abroad. So European firms were particularly interested, and initially they were also particularly present in all of the GCC countries, in all of the economic sectors. So the EU in particular, European countries sort of understood that it was most important to come together and negotiate under the EU with the GCC to achieve better conditions for trade and investment. So there, the story is one of really mixed successes. There was a free trade agreement that has been in negotiation since really the late 80s, early 90s, and it's still not seen the light. The reason for it is that it's also partly ingrained in the European interest towards the Gulf, that it is a fairly uneven flow of goods. Mostly the GCC buying from Europe, but Europe buying very little from the GCC. And of course, the GCC negotiators saw that imbalance as a problem. Investment fared better, definitely better, because the GCC countries, as they accumulated wealth, they also started to become very important investors around the world, and mostly in the United States, and also in Europe. So basically where they had a clear-cut also political and geopolitical interest. So that, you know, things moved along a little more smoothly, but also, you know, in terms of policy, it wasn't the easiest conversation to have. So what happened then? It happened that European countries, member states of the European Union, decided to really put the emphasis on bilateral relations. They preferred to move to a bilateral level and to have discussions directly with member states of the GCC countries, so individual Gulf monarchies. And so you started to have all of these bilateral agreements that covered the various issues, from economy to investment to a little bit of political and security dialogue, but very negligible because the priorities were very clearly economic. And some discussions on socioeconomic issues, cultural exchanges, and so on and so forth. And that sort of, on one end, clearly there was a much quicker achievements, because it's definitely easier to negotiate at a bilateral level, but also generated some intra-EU competition that in the end was counterproductive, because the GCC countries sometimes could put one European country against another, for example, to get better condition on some particular dossiers, and even, you know, simply among them, that lingering economic competition was an obstacle to developing a stronger voice at the EU level, and even to strengthen the political dialogue, where there were, in the rare occasions that there were, you know, dossiers that were particularly interesting on any political point of view. And I'm thinking, for example, if again we're looking a little bit towards the past, at the Israel-Palestine conflict. For the longest time, you know, the Europeans were particularly interested. The EU was also engaged, was part of the quartet, and it was clear that the Gulf monarchies did have some capacity to act on the Israel-Palestine conflict, but it was quite difficult to get a unified EU position and then sort of present it to the GCC counterparts. So that is, you know, fast forward to today. Where are we today? The situation is sort of putting the dots back together from the past, and a few elements that come back. We already mentioned that there is a security vacuum in the Gulf, definitely at the level of perceptions by the GCC countries. With the US retrenching, the GCC monarchies are definitely looking to diversify their security partnerships, and are also sort of reaching out to European countries bilaterally, mostly because of the lack of a military aspect and military capacity of the EU as one. And for example, I'm thinking of the growing relationship between France and the United Arab Emirates. So if you, for example, have followed the recent attacks by the Houthis with missiles and drones against the UAE, you probably have also heard that France was the one European country and the only country besides the United States to offer some security support in the form of the deployment of a few Rafale fighter jets with the mission of surveilling the skies above the UAE and helping them spot and hopefully intercept missiles and drones fired from Yemen. And that, sort of mini development is also a sign and a signal of some of the European countries, and especially France, looking at the Gulf and really thinking that the Europeans should become a little bit more present in the security mosaic as the US retrenches. So this also explains why, for example, France has launched EMASO, the European Maritime Awareness Mission in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a maritime security mission based on a coalition of European countries led by France that doesn't go through the EU, but it's a collective informal group of European countries that patrol the Strait of Hormuz, in particular trying to deter attacks via naval mines or even missiles or other asymmetrical attacks that could disrupt trade in the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz is really becoming a very important crossroads and hub for trade that also involves a lot of European interests. The reason for that is that if the Arabian Peninsula was in a strategic location under the Cold War because of proximity to Asia and Russia, it is now strategic because it is literally at the crossroads between China and Europe. And if you look at the numbers of how much the trade flows between Europe and China and in general East Asia is skyrocketing, and all of the linked economic relations and flows and economic flows are increasing very much, you will definitely sort of see the importance of the Gulf as a logistics hub between Europe and East Asia. And so in this sense, there is a new conversation going on in European capitals individually rather than at the EU predominantly about the importance of security, especially in the waterways, the Strait of Hormuz and the Straits. The Strait of Hormuz on one side and Bab el-Mandab on the other side. Bab el-Mandab being the strait between Yemen and the Horn of Africa, which is of course quite threatened by the ongoing conflict in Yemen. The other reason is what we mentioned, that after 2011, the Gulf countries are now really important actors all around the region. They have shown to be able to have game-changing inputs and interventions in crises such as Libya, to a lesser extent in Syria. As Gudrun mentioned, they had a key role in supporting first the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and their government in 2011 and 12, but also then in the military coup that ousted the Muslim Brotherhood and put Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as the leader of Egypt. They have been extremely important also in Tunisia in the latest political and constitutional crisis. They are now key interlocutor to try and rescue Yemen for the full collapse of the state, which includes, a tremendous energy insecurity, but also infrastructural decay. And the same goes for Iraq to some extent. And then finally, they are also becoming more important, possibly more important in the realm of energy. And here is where we sort of slide into looking towards the future. there is no question that the EU will move towards a big reliance on renewable energy between now and 2050 because of the commitments that we have taken under the European Green Deal and the climate commitments that we have taken under that. So there are a lot of ongoing efforts, this time both at the especially at the EU level, so especially in Brussels, but also at the level of European capitals, to explore different potential sources of renewable energy in the form of, for example, green hydrogen or electricity. And the Arabian Peninsula has a lot of potential in that regard. They have a lot of space where they can build immense solar and other renewable energy power plants. And they are already starting to work in that direction in producing, even today, the cheapest solar energy in the world, and also very competitive prices on green hydrogen, for example. So if the EU is seriously going to move towards relying a lot on renewable energy, especially in the beginning, they will need to rely on import, and they will need to rely on import from secure imports and competitive prices. And large quantities. So the GCC countries do provide sort of opportunities in that sense. Now, to do that and to look into the future in that sense means also looking at connectivity and therefore, related questions of security to secure the energy imports that would come from there. And as mentioned, the EU is working now also most prominently on this question, together with the question of continued EU support for the diversification of the economies of the GCC countries, which is now become a more important and predominant topic and really a priority for a few of the governments of the area. And also towards a more sustained in connection to that political dialogue, at least at the level of consultations and dialogue about their growing role throughout the region, from the Horn of Africa to the Levant to North Africa. And so this is, the work that is being done. It's still at the level of exploration, but things are changing quite fast. And I think, just to close off, while, we do think of and work on these issues in the future, it's relevant to put that into the context of today's crisis, which is the one in the Ukraine. And we've probably already heard that Qatar, for example, was front and center in the news cycle, was invited for consultations in Washington, and also mentioned a lot of work in the EU to talk with Qatar about the possibility of Qatar providing LNG to Europe to sort of offset possible disruptions coming from Russia, and to also contain the skyrocketing prices of gas. And we can see that in our energy bills every month that are linked to the crisis in Ukraine and potential disruptions and instability in the energy market. I wanted to give you a quick overview of a lot of different issues and put a lot on the plate, but now I think I'll give back the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. This was really very interesting, and of course there is so much in it. I already also saw 2 questions, and it's hard to fix where we start. When you mentioned that for much time, or I think it's still valid today, the EU had difficulties to present common positions and common vision. In a way, this is also very valid for the GCC countries, isn't it? Because they started as a security project, but of course there were ambitions from some sides to have more, and it doesn't seem to work. And one of these questions, and I wanted also to ask you the question, and it's one of the 2 questions also, is the very interesting development of relationships to Israel, which is of course also, I mean, observed in Europe and I mean, welcomed in Europe. But first of all, I mean, relations of EU countries with these states. What is important is, for example, these Abraham Accords of Emirates and Bahrain important? How do you see the other states? And does it play a role? I mean, we did not mention the, how can I say, the image of these countries. It's true that, for example, the UAE had an amazing development of their role beyond the region, but they are also considered a completely new type of autocratic systems, no? But still autocratic systems. And do we ignore it? Is it an issue? Tell us more about the political relations, if possible.
All excellent questions. So first of all, definitely the GCC is much less cohesive than the EU. So yes, I mean, we talk about the EU lack of coordination, but the GCC itself is really in a state of collapse almost. And we have seen, you know, especially after 2017, of course, there was the political boycott and economic embargo against Qatar by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, together with Egypt and other regional countries. But even after the Al-Ula agreement that was signed in 2020, which solved the crisis, the underlying issues are not solved. And definitely, at the level of institution, the GCC suffered tremendously, because you can, to a certain extent, if you think and contextualize politics in the GCC as extremely personalized, which it is, then you can think that the leaders as individuals can try to move past some issues and some disagreements and sort of look at other national interests. But the GCC as an institution suffered a lot from the crisis. Already it was dormant. It was, every time they meet up, they produce communiques that are really watered down to the lowest common denominator. They're very rhetorical. They're just mostly a copy paste of the previous communique. So really the coordination there is very, very bad. And that's one reason that pushed the European Union even to have so-called cooperation agreement with individual countries in the Gulf. So the EU has sort of acknowledged and accepted the fact that the GCC is rather dysfunctional now, and they are going individually to the individual countries to sign agreements that are specifically tailored to the needs and the opportunities offered by the individual countries. So they signed, I think, with all of them now. Yes, with all of them, all of the six different agreements, with a few things in common. One of those things is, to get to another question that you posed, one condition that the EU placed is that they ought to have a human rights dialogue. And everybody, I mean, it was difficult at first, but all of the GCC countries accepted that, including Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was the most difficult one, but they finally accepted to have a human rights dialogue, and they already had the first session. So now, this was also a condition that the EU insisted and insists it must be part of a free trade agreement. And this is one of the issues that really blocked the negotiations on a free trade agreement, because the EU in its format with around the world, with any country in the world, they have the human rights clauses in the free trade agreements. So, but the GCC sort of countries rebuked that, because to them, first of all, they didn't want to mix economy with other questions, but also it was extremely difficult because they don't accept the characterization in Europe that they are major human rights violators. They don't accept that politically, and to have it black and white in an official document would be extremely problematic for them. Having said that, of course, on a practical level, the conversations are different. And, for example, if we take Saudi Arabia, especially after the leadership, under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and King Salman since 2015, when we talk of human rights, we talk of different things. We talk of women's rights, we talk of the rights of minorities, we talk of political and civil rights, we talk of religious freedom, and we talk of freedom of opinion and freedom of speech. And on the different domains, in some of them, we have seen a strong deterioration of the situation. So things have gotten worse in some of these files, definitely on political freedom, freedom of speech, and all that is civil rights related freedoms. In some other domains, we have seen clear improvement on the issue of women's rights, on the issue of religious freedom, on the issue of even workers' rights, foreign workers in all of the GCC countries, especially when they work as laborers, so in lower paid jobs. They have had to face really quite starking violation of their rights, including, for example, the withdrawal of their passports that used to be a prerogative of their employer, and the employer could decide whether they would give it back or not. This system called the kafala system is now being partially overcome in some of these countries, has been weakened in some of these countries. For example, in Qatar, thanks to the pressure also of the International Labour Organization in connection with the fact that they will host the World Cup this year. So what does it mean? It means that even the leadership of these countries, such as Mohammed bin Salman, given that they have introduced all of these reforms, they understand that before them, these were problems, that these things needed to be done. And so there is that, privately, there is that sort of approach that is a little bit more constructive than their official position and political position, which is a flat rejection of criticism. But this is clearly an issue that will always be important in Europe, and that resonates very strongly with the public opinion, which is something that all elected leaders in Europe, in the individual countries and in the European Union, really have very present with them at all times. They always, every time we have policy conversations about political relations, official will bring up the fact that their electorate is extremely sensitive to these issues. So I think, if you ask me what should be done, I think having this human rights dialogue and trying to push in those issues where there seem to be more opportunity and more potential would be a constructive approach. One of the things that, for example, at the European Council on Foreign Relations we're trying to push for is religious freedom. And this is also connected to the Abraham Accords, which was your other question. The Abraham Accords, clearly in the European Union, generally speaking, have been very well received. And at the same time, they have been seen as a way or a platform to build on in different directions. That means extending potentially these agreements to other GCC countries. Clearly, the big prize there is Saudi Arabia. Right now, and as long as King Salman is leading the country together with the older senior generation of royals, it is very difficult for Saudi Arabia to make that move. But with the younger generation, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and many of the people around him who are below 40 years of age, they definitely have a different approach towards Israel, much less ideological. And in connection to that, we think that there is scope to work on religious freedom in the Gulf, in all of the GCC countries. Some of them, like Bahrain, are already quite advanced. but there is a lot of work to do. And there, I think, you know, we see much more openness towards that, to having the first official church in Saudi Arabia, to having really religious dialogue and open and enshrined in the law the freedom of people to practice whatever religion they prefer. But of course, the Abraham Accords are not only about social, cultural, and religious and sort of social and cultural relations. They're about much more, in particular, the one between Israel and the UAE. It's, for example, about connectivity, because we were mentioning the GCC countries do really see themselves as hubs between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. And so if they have relations with Israel, they can think about long-term infrastructural projects to link up directly and being able to bring their energy, even, you know, renewable energy or electricity, straight to the Mediterranean, or to develop, you know, some sort of planning for trade, especially maritime trade, where they invest in infrastructures in Israel as well as other Mediterranean countries to facilitate the trade flows directly in a direct connection towards the Mediterranean. That would, for example, you know, sort of cut out, in the best case scenario, also the long journey that today ships make transiting through very dangerous Strait of Hormuz and Bab al-Mandab. So there are, you know, there's this dimension of connectivity and then digital connectivity, also, you know, underwater cable and mega cables for faster internet and faster transfer of data. Google, for example, is working on a cable that would ideally connect directly Italy with India, transiting through the Levant, potentially Israel, and the Arabian Peninsula. So all that files of connectivity. And then also, you know, cybersecurity. The UAE is a small country, such as Israel. They have a small military, and they have a lot of security needs and very high threat perceptions. So for them to be able to become global players in cybersecurity gives them the kind, and artificial intelligence gives them the kind of competitive edge and advantage that they would never have in conventional warfare or conventional deterrence and security. And finally, coordination against Iran. We have seen in the past year that Gulf monarchies have opened dialogue with Iran, but it's fair to say that this hasn't really gone to great lengths. It's been quite unsatisfactory. Definitely their perspectives on the need to contain Iran has not changed. It's exactly the same as it has been in the past few years. So how do you contain Iran without alienating and Iran to the point that you risk receiving increased missile and drones attacks, for example? You do that by opening channel of communications, but also providing yourself with an extra layer of deterrence, which, for example, could be a strategic relations with Israel as viewed from the Gulf, because, of course, Iran is very careful about what they do against Israel. And so by extension, the cooperation of the Israeli intelligence and strategic agreements between Israel and the UAE sort of should, in theory, at least in the thinking of Emirati leaders, provide that extra friend that might be particularly useful.
Well, you confirm that we are really in a completely new era, a new time. I mean, if you could have imagined such words 10 years ago, no, very difficult. I want to ask one question, because you mentioned France, and France is a good example, but there are also other countries like Austria, who, of course, would say they also stress human rights and so on, but they are buying one very strong narrative, which comes especially from the United Arab Emirates, but also from Saudi Arabia, which is the Muslim Brothers are the only problem Islam has. And I think, I mean, the French support for, I mean, it's, of course, I put it too simply. I mean, I don't say it's that simple, but it seems that also security-wise, we are sometimes very much influenced by them, aren't we?
I mean, this is also a great question, and it's good to sometimes to in a way simplify these conversations, especially as we're trying to cover a lot of ground and do it in a way that isn't too heavy on our on our kind followers and listeners. So this is a great point. In effect, the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, have really put quite some pressure on European governments, including the United Kingdom, a lot of it on the United Kingdom, to contain the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood and all of the NGOs that in their eyes are viewed as linked ideologically or organizationally or simply, informally to the Muslim Brotherhood and operate in Europe. And as you correctly said, France in particular really bought this narrative for the longest time. It was also partly because they were genuinely convinced of that. And that conviction, that belief stems out of a number of issues. One of them is this idea of laïcité and the fact that, for France and French officials, and there's sort of an institutional memory and DNA ingrained in it, where religion should really be only relegated to the sphere of the private life of people and should not be mixed with politics in any way. And that was sort of the basic ground. Then it was made much, much worse after the terrorist attacks of 2015 in France. And the emotions ran incredibly high, and it was very difficult to explain to the electorate as well, which was also ingrained in this rationale of laïcité, that the Muslim Brotherhood was in fact a different kind of Islamism, a very different kind of Islamism than jihadism, which was a different movement. But these nuances really got lost in translation, and emotions got really high, and domestic politics played a lot into it. Also
in Austria, if I may say. The same here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's correct. And I remember when we looked at that, which was, I have to say, with some relief, populist parties seem to be a little bit weaker in Austria, in France, even the latest polls. The most right-wing parties, yes, of course, still some consensus, but I think we are in a slightly less worrying situation than we were perhaps in 2015, after 2015, and before the first election of Emmanuel Macron, and how sort of French politicians would explain that even the moderate parties had to adopt some of these themes of the more right-wing, more extremist parties, because they felt that they were these extreme themes were clicking so much with the electorate. And so they sort of, for domestic politics reason, they also contributed to the fact that they saw eye to eye with the UAE on some of these questions. So one last point I want to make about the Muslim Brotherhood is that there is, something new, which is less pressure on the behalf of the Saudis and on behalf of the Emiratis against the Muslim Brotherhood. And one of the main reasons is because from their point of view, and I stress from their point of view, the Muslim Brotherhood has lost the great game of the post-Arab Spring. They are now, from their point of view, weak in North Africa. They support Kais Saied in his attempt to really make Nahda a very marginal player, if not an outlaw player in the Tunisian politics. And it's weaker even in at the heart of the support for the political project linked to the Muslim Brotherhood in the region, which is Turkey. What one of the things that explains the UAE outreach to Turkey is that their perception that Erdogan is at its weakest. And he's now much softer and much readier to give concessions. And for example, we already know that the Turkey sort of strongly encouraged individuals linked to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood to move away from Turkey. And they encouraged the media linked to that, wider environment and wider narrative to soften their narrative and soften their message. And, it's very similar to what we have seen, for example, between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Saudi Arabia also, one of the first things that asked Qatar was to tone down the rhetoric in support for Islamism and against Mohammed bin Salman into all of the media and think tanks and associated organizations where Qatar had any sort of influence. So of course, starting with Al Jazeera, but not stopping there. So I think, that is also changing a little bit.
Very interesting. And I think this analysis that they are weaker is correct. No, they lost, for example, also elections in Morocco in a way. No?
Yeah.
I have a very interesting question here, which I want to ask you. Could Dr. Bianco comment on coordination between the EU and the UK vis-a-vis the GCC countries? I think it's a really good question, because also I remember then when it was decided that UK leaves the EU, we even had an event about what would it have the consequences in EU or also UK Middle Eastern policies, and how and would the cooperation continue, or what would happen? I mean, for example, we see the cooperation continue regarding the JCPOA. It's still E3, also if one of the E3 countries is not in the European Union anymore. I think it's a good question.
It is a great question, because as you said, it was one of the main issues, and in particular with the GCC, because Britain was the former colonial or protectorate power in the GCC. They had a level of penetration in the security realm and in the political realm that was unique in Europe. They had senior relations at the political level. They still had a lot of assets and have a lot of assets militarily in the region. They have, very good capacity to coordinate also technically on an economic front. They have a very, very widespread presence on in the sociocultural realm and soft power in general. So it was particularly sort of important that there was continued cooperation and coordination with the UK in the GCC, where they were stronger than us. But sadly, that hasn't happened. I think, clearly this is a much broader issue in the sense that as you mentioned, I lived in London for many years, and also throughout the transitional period. And I already then I saw that basically all dossiers were seen through the Brexit prism. And I honestly went back there this year, and I don't think, last year, end of last year, and I don't think anything have changed there. So all of the issues are seen through the prism of Brexit. That means that, for example, one of the first things that the UK did after Brexit was to travel to the GCC. That was Theresa May when that happened, and push for a new process on achieving a free trade agreement. Which for them is incredibly important, because already they export quite a lot to the GCC countries, and clearly losing potentially market in the EU, they needed to have some sort of cushion for that. So they kickstarted the negotiations. The negotiations stopped during the time of the Qatar crisis, and they are already restarted as soon as they signed the Al Ula agreement, that was saying that the Qatar crisis was over. So in that sense, the UK sees itself in competition with the EU and other European countries in the GCC. And because they are stronger than the EU there on some levels, they want to sort of harness that competitive advantage to their national interests and their advantage. And they're not particularly open to coordination with the EU on issues pertaining to the GCC countries. And so, yeah, we haven't seen any, even after, when there was EMA, so the French-led maritime security mission in the Strait of Hormuz was launched, the UK decided to join the rival competing maritime security mission launched by Trump. And, that would have been arguably a perfect opportunity, because the mission launched by Trump was clearly anti-Iran, whereas the UK was closer to the EU and to France in how they view Iran, as you correctly said. But despite that, they still decided to go with the US mission. And coordination on other issues, including, for example, the war in Yemen, is minimal, if there is any, even at the level of discussion. So it's not really going anywhere productive.
Well, this is really a pity, but perhaps, when you divorce, it's perhaps you keep separated for a time, and hopefully this friendship will develop afterwards.
Yeah.
Well, we are almost at 1 hour. May I ask you a question also regarding GCC integration, because you mentioned that GCC is even near a collapse, even if a kind of reconciliation has taken place. My question would be, I mentioned already the change of leadership in Kuwait and in Oman. And one of the questions, of course, would be if these two leaderships, which are not to be compared, it's totally different situation, but would perhaps be more open also to Saudi influence, because Kuwait, the old emir, was very conscious of keeping his own line, and Oman was an island of its own, and also as a mediator, always keeping away from certain things. Did something change? Do you see changes in that respect?
Yeah, that's another very good question, because yes, there are changes. In Oman, as you said, they cherish very much their autonomy. They see themselves as similar, but yet significantly different from the other GCC countries from several point of views. The most important being, their history, which is a history even of a small empire that was led by Oman, and Muscat was the capital. So they see that is very much ingrained in their national identity. Then also, the religious composition of the country is different. The sort of soft, intangible element of their religious culture are different, and even national identity. So this autonomy is something that Oman really cherishes, and it will always arguably do that. However, having said that, Oman is in at a delicate juncture. The leadership change was very significant, because Sultan Qaboos was the founder of Oman and the only ruler of modern Oman, and ruled for over 40 years. So this Sultan Haytham is really the first leader after the founding father of Oman to lead the country in its modern contemporary way. And this very delicate transition happens also at a time where Oman has significant financial and economic challenges to face. They have much less energy resources than the other countries, and they have a bigger population, and they have really significant numbers of youth unemployment. And they really need investments. And they bet very strongly on the JCPOA to become another potential transit hub for re-export and import towards and from Iran. So basically the role that Dubai played for a few years, the Omanis thought if there is a deal, a nuclear deal that is sustainable and is final, then we can also play that role because the trade and investment towards Iran will have to transit towards a more Western friendly country, which is Oman. And a country that has better infrastructures, because Iran still needs a lot of investment to update and modernize its own infrastructure. Even if you think about banking and all, the financial transactions, especially in the beginning, they cannot go directly to Iran especially from the West. They have to, be processed at another regional, potentially, institution that can sort of, if you will, can talk well and dialogue and interface well, both towards the West, but also with Iran. So they bet a lot on the benefits of the JCPOA. And when the JCPOA collapsed, they felt exposed. And then, the war in Yemen, which poses a big security threat for them, given that they border Yemen, and that region that borders Yemen in Oman has a restive past, as a past of revolution, if we go back a few decades. So security challenges, economic challenges, and political challenges linked to the transition. What happened was that Oman needed more solid relations with its neighbors. And therefore, yes, they did work on building better relations with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has, in exchange, sort of taken steps towards large investments in Oman that span across all sectors. And that means that, yes, Saudi Arabia also has some political, much sort of greater political influence in Oman. That doesn't mean that Oman would do Saudi Arabia's bidding, but yes, there is more influence. And, the same could be said for Kuwait. If you leave out economic challenges, Kuwait has its own economic challenges, but they are nowhere as severe as Oman's in terms of the debt that they have to repay to international investors is much, much lower. Youth unemployment is much, much lower. So they have some economic challenges, of course, because they depend too much on energy revenues, but it's nowhere comparable. However, they do have security challenges because they border Iraq. And they have political challenges linked not only to the transition, but to the fact that Kuwait sadly has this problem of continuous confrontation between the leadership and government on one end and the parliament on the other hand. There is something, and it's sad to say, because Kuwait is the only country in the Gulf that has a parliament. And is the one sort of experiment in that. They're all autocratic, absolute monarchies. So we're not talking about any form of democracy in any shape here. But still, the Kuwait does have a more representative elected parliament. And it's a pity that something in the institutional design there is not working as it should, because the confrontation and the tension between the parliament and government and leadership is really sort of freezing the country and preventing it to move forward on many levels. And so that continuous political infighting means that there are political vulnerabilities there, and therefore also encourages Kuwait to get closer to Saudi Arabia, especially when you have in the leadership someone like Crown Prince Mishal, who is the new crown prince of Kuwait, and who has a natural affinity to some of the thinking in the other GCC capitals, such as Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, but especially Saudi Arabia, and a strong personal relationship to the Saudi leaders as well.
And I think Michal more or less also took over lately more and more duties from the emir. No?
You're correct.
When I thought this is happening, what you are now describing is when Kuwait joined the boycott of Lebanon.
Yeah.
This was amazing. Perhaps under the old emir they wouldn't. I mean, I don't know enough about Kuwait.
Yeah, no, you're right. There is something there that, you know, it's not too public, which is that while they joined the boycott, they also are working right now as we speak on a proposal to overcome the boycott, which has been, you know, presented to the other GCC countries, but also to the EU, interestingly, and to a few European countries. So they try to still, you know, be that mediator, but closer to Saudi.
Well, I don't see any questions anymore. You know, I could continue, of course, another hour without any problem. There is something. Sorry, we take this one. No, this is only a thank you, which I read in not only from our discussion participant, but also from my side and from our side. Thank you for this wide-ranging, highly informative, high-quality tour d'horizon, and it's absolutely correct. I cannot express it better, and it's definitely we want to see you personally in Vienna to continue this conversation. It's I mean, such a fascinating topic. I said how I said it's also new. I mean, not the topic is new, but that we really deal in depth with it and look with much attention at that region. And it's great to have such an expert as our guest, and I hope it will not be the last time. I'm sure it will not be the last time.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure, and I enjoyed a lot of the conversation. As you said, there is a lot to unpack, and I'm sure there is going to be a lot more next time that we speak. Hopefully,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye bye to Berlin.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.